Welcome to the Cheating Wife Stories channel. The plain manila envelope Trevor Whittaker carried in his hand felt like it weighed a ton. With his world teetering on the edge of complete and utter collapse, the contents of that package felt like a huge milestone around his neck. At just 27, his life had been nearly perfect up until this point. He was on a path that most would envy and some would kill for. He had already made more than enough to pay off his home, and still afford several luxuries as a financial analyst for a conglomerate of corporate investors. Trevor was not only well-liked, but also well-connected. On top of that, for the last 3 years, he had been successfully wooing Nancy, the only child of Kathy and Robert. 14 months ago, Trevor and Nancy had fallen head over heels in love, and now their wedding was just 6 weeks away. His future father-in-law was the CEO of Sterling Industries, and just having Robert mention your name was tantamount to a job offer in some circles. After easing out of his Porsche Carrera, Trevor headed up the lighted walk to the front door of Albert Manor. His body was tense, and all his recent nightmares seemed to lurk, ready to pounce from the surrounding darkness. I can't believe it's only been 3 freaking weeks. Feels more like 3 years. He bitterly muttered to himself, pausing to look up into the heavens beyond the stars. Trevor mentally questioned God. What did I do to deserve this? Which one of my long-forgotten indiscretions pissed you off enough to warrant this final retribution? As he pressed the doorbell, its faint sound made him think, this must be how ancient warriors felt when preparing for a hopeless battle, one in which there would be no winners. As Trevor waited for the door to open, his mouth was dry, and he couldn't seem to catch his breath. The moment of truth had arrived. Trevor's fears were now a reality. Memories of that fateful day caused his stomach to feel unsettled as he recalled the events of that Monday morning. A very important client had called, requesting an emergency meeting in another city 2 hours away. He had given Trevor the details and the name of the hotel where he was staying. Trevor immediately cleared his calendar while gathering the information needed to meet his client's busy schedule. Trevor decided that driving would be quicker and less risky than going to the airport, catching a flight, and renting a car. But facing a long drive put him under a lot of pressure and set the rest of his day off track. Set up in a partially secluded alcove off the hotel's main dining room, the meeting went well. After taking all the information, Trevor presented it to his client, who rushed off to catch a flight. Even with the 2-hour drive, Trevor realized that by hurrying, he could still get back in time to beat the afternoon rush hour. That alone would cut an extra hour off his workday. From where he sat, Trevor could see into the spacious, well-lit atrium of the main lobby. While putting away his materials, a movement through the garden area caught his eye. It was one of those things that, for some unknown reason, you turned your head to get a closer look. Trevor's world suddenly turned upside down, and his eyes widened when he spotted Kathy, his future mother-in-law, walking toward him. His internal alarms were going off like crazy as Trevor watched her intimately clutching the arm of a man he didn't immediately recognize. As they got closer, Trevor realized it was Kenneth, one of her husband's biggest competitors. As luck would have it, a few moments later, Kathy and her male companion were seated just a few tables away from Trevor. He hurriedly scanned the room, quickly realizing he would be in full view, no matter which way he tried to leave. With a sick feeling, but discretion being the better part of valor, Trevor finished packing his equipment, hoping for an opportunity to slip out of the building unnoticed. Trevor was extremely agitated by his present circumstances. Unable to make an escape, he spent the next few minutes cautiously observing them, holding hands, kissing, giggling, and whispering little secrets to each other. With adrenaline surging through his body, fear swept over Trevor when he noticed the lunch crowd was beginning to thin out. When the server arrived to take their orders, Trevor was able to hear every word. After the waiter walked away, Kathy almost sighed and said, "We still have a bit of time, baby. But let's hurry before I go home to my boring hubby. I need at least a few more of those special quivers that only you make me feel." Nervously, Kathy glanced around to make sure no one was listening, then excused herself to freshen up. Kathy was out of sight before Trevor decided it was time to make a move. Trying his best not to be seen, Trevor silently prayed as he passed by their table, suddenly aware that Kenneth was looking in the other direction. He took advantage of the situation, making a beeline straight for one of the entrances. Looking to his car, Trevor tossed his files into the trunk. After getting in, he locked the doors and just sat, staring hopelessly at the wall in front of him. Trevor's pounding heart was reverberating in his ears like the sound of a steel rod beating on a kettle drum. The pressure was making his head feel like it was about to explode. Fraught with fear, Trevor questioned, "What the hell am I supposed to do now?" On the way home, all he could think was, "I'm so damn screwed." Nancy peppered Trevor with fresh ideas from the previous weekend's bridal show. Even though he was sitting right beside her, she wasn't having any luck hitting his attention. Unable to get Trevor involved in last-minute changes was making Nancy very frustrated. For the last few days, she had started to become very concerned over the persistent funk he had fallen into. "Nancy, please pay attention, honey. This is very important," Nancy pleaded as he continued to drift in thought. Nancy's voice exploded with aggravation. "Damn it, Trevor. Where is your head? You've been 1,000 miles away ever since Tanya, Emily, and I got back from the bridal show at Hilton Head with her." With her normally vibrant and bubbly voice slowly degenerating into a childish whimper, she added, "Every time I ask, you keep saying there's nothing wrong. But babe, you're scaring the hell out of me." Seeing the concern and frustration in Nancy's eyes, Trevor swallowed hard. "I'm sorry, Han. Please believe me. You've done nothing wrong. It's just something I found out while having lunch with a client, and it could have severe repercussions. The problem is, right now, we don't need that." She leaned in close and said softly in his ear, "I think we've both become too distracted with other issues, and we're losing sight of what is truly important. It's time to refocus on each other. What do you say, stud?" Nancy asked while seductively and lovingly rubbing her hand from his chest to the nape of his neck. Trevor shuddered, melting into a puddle of quivering flesh as she playfully licked his ear, teasing him unmercifully. Suddenly, Nancy squealed in surprise as he lifted her and set her on the kitchen table. As Trevor began making love to her, she jokingly teased, "Well, Aunt Wendy did smile when she gave us that sex begins in the kitchen book." Her ensuing giggle filled the room. Later that morning, as his fiancée showered, Trevor was still struggling with his dilemma. "I've got to try and straighten out this mess. I need some proof, something that will shock Kathy, maybe even get her to stop. That would be the easiest way to end this nightmare." After Nancy left to go shopping, Trevor made his decision. He began checking listings for private detectives. After selecting one, he called and made an appointment for later that day. In just 2 days, it would be exactly 3 weeks since life had so quickly and cruelly conspired against Trevor's happiness. He was overwhelmed by how life's wrecking ball of circumstances was poised to destroy his ideal existence. Trevor now found himself staring at what was evidently a stack of evidence that had just been placed on the conference table in front of him. He listened intently as the private investigator began to explain. "The CD contains all the video and audio that we've been able to obtain between Kathy and her lover. The first envelope, marked Photos, is just that, pictures of them in various locations. We caught them doing everything from talking to cuddling, while dining, walking, or just sitting together. The second envelope contains photos of them in various sex acts. The third and final envelope contains a printed transcript of the audio, which includes all conversations between them that our investigators were able to record." Dynamite. That's exactly what it reminds me of, Trevor thought, staring at the evidence. A stick of pure dynamite, so damn small and harmless looking, yet potentially explosive. No, in this case, it's more like a nuclear warhead. Trevor reached for the audio transcript. The printout completely obliterated any possible doubts that Kathy was having an affair or with whom she was having it. While reading the report, Trevor was shocked to discover the consistent verbal disrespect Kathy showed towards her husband when talking with her lover. He was stunned not only by their jokes about Robert's performance, in and out of bed, but also by her professed ability to control her husband. Kathy was effectively bragging about leading Robert around by the nose. However, it had been Trevor's experience when around them that Robert was firmly but lovingly in control. They had always seemed to respect each other. Trevor was amazed at how easily Kathy had deceived everyone. As he continued to skim through the transcript, Trevor noticed that the PI had caught them getting together at least 4 times in less than 2 weeks to have sex. Dan, he thought while shaking his head. Considering their ages, she and Kenneth are worse than a couple of rabbits. A highlighted portion of the exchange between the couple suddenly caught Trevor's eye. Kathy, when are you going to file for divorce, baby? I can't wait until you're all mine. As he read her reply, Trevor could just hear Kathy's New England accent. Kathy, Kin, I told you we have to wait until after Nancy's wedding. That way she won't get hurt as much. Besides, for now, you're getting all the sex. By the way, you're the only one since my husband. Mr. Wonderful hasn't seen me for a month, and you can rest assured he won't ever again if I can help it. Kin, oh, Kathy, I do love you. Kathy, well, sexy man, I love you too. Trevor's heart beat wildly as he began to grasp the depth of his predicament. He was just starting to fully understand her impact on his life. What didn't make sense was how Kathy could even consider dumping Robert for that greasy slimeball, Kenneth. Sighing deeply, Trevor dropped his head in dejection while muttering, "Where Robert's concerned, I've got no choice. He's been good to me, treating me like a son. Robert deserves to know, but there's no way I'm going to look at the visual evidence. I'd never be able to look Kathy in the eyes again." While fiddling with the clasp on the package, his stomach fluttered as he sat quietly thinking, I pray that by some miracle, she and Robert can find a way to work this situation out. After thanking the PI, Trevor rose to leave. According to his car, he quietly conceded, I'm screwed. Just plain screwed. Later, while with Nancy, Trevor felt a desperate need to convey his deep love for her. He chose a special way, with wine, food, and song, at their favorite restaurant. Afterwards, Nancy conveyed her deep love all night long. As the sun came up, she just smiled when Nancy said, Damn, babe, keep this up, and I'll have to cancel my plans for the spa this weekend with the girls. This will be the second time Tanya, Emily, and I have been out together in less than a month anyway, she purred seductively. Or do you just want to save everything up for when I get back Sunday? No, Han. Go ahead with your plans. I can use the extra time to clear up a few loose ends before the wedding, Trevor said. He couldn't tell her that he was relieved she was going to be out of town, as it would give him the perfect opportunity to unload his horrendous burden. Tired of dealing with it, Trevor had decided that no matter what the consequences, it was going to be Robert's problem after this weekend. The following afternoon, he picked up the phone and made the call. It's good to hear from you, Trevor. I've been meaning to call, but just hadn't gotten around to it yet, Robert said in a strong but strained voice. Trevor nervously blurted out, Hey, Robert, I really need to talk to you. I was wondering, could we possibly get together sometime this weekend? Trevor realized it wasn't his smoothest delivery and thought, so much for trying to stay relaxed. I have some things I need to discuss with you also, Robert stated, then inquired, how about Saturday night for dinner? Kathy is going to be at her sister's this weekend to visit her family and some old friends. Isn't this also the weekend Nancy is going to the spa? Yes, it is, Trevor responded enthusiastically. So it'll only be us men, Robert replied. Good. How about, say, around 6? Will that work for you, buddy? Sounds good to me, Trevor replied. I'll see you then. Good enough. I'll look forward to seeing you then, Robert affirmed. After they hung up, Trevor sat thinking, God, yes, Let me get this over with as quickly as possible. It's just sad that it's always someone like Robert who gets dumped on, even though it seems strange. Trevor thought Robert sounded relieved that it would be just the two of them. I wonder if Robert already knows something. Maybe this isn't going to be that big of a surprise after all. But for now, Trevor had other urgent things on his mind. How Nancy would handle all this was another major concern. At that moment, waiting for the door to open, weeks of nervous anxiety had him feeling like he was about to explode. Trevor apprehensively said to himself, "Damn, this is going to be even more painful than I thought." Suddenly, he was jerked back to the present by the sound of a deadbolt as Robert opened the door. "Hello, Trevor. Excellent timing. Why don't you go into the den and make yourself at home while I grab us a couple of beers?" Robert said. Trevor's mouth went bone dry as Robert's eyes suddenly flicked downward to the envelope. Before Robert could ask, Trevor quickly replied, "Thanks. I could sure use one." At the same time, he thought, 6 would be better with a big shot of bourbon. But I'll take whatever I can get. Glancing around the den, Trevor could easily tell that Robert used the room as a home office. Moments later, his host returned with their beers. After shaking hands and exchanging a few pleasantries, Robert walked around to the other side of his desk and sat down. Trevor could tell by the way Robert dropped into his chair that Nancy's father was deeply troubled by something. I bet he already knows, Trevor thought. Robert slipped on his glasses and leaned forward to read the name on Trevor's envelope, now lying on the desk in front of him. "It would appear you already know," Robert said in a wooden voice. "How did you discover the situation?" "I stumbled onto it completely by accident," Trevor replied. Before Trevor could answer further, Robert continued, but with sudden anger. "Damn it. It's a simple fact that you know should make me feel better, but it doesn't. With a lot of very important people scheduled to be here over the next few weeks, it was imperative to inform you. I had no alternatives, considering the strong possibility of public exposure hanging over us. Honestly, Trevor, I'm amazed this hasn't already made the gossip columns. I'm just sorry that both of us have to deal with the pain and fallout of this sleazy mess." Robert stood and walked over to a large picture window overlooking the huge pool and patio area below. He continued, "Trevor, dealing with this has been very difficult for me. Trying to figure out what to say, and to whom has left me so damn frustrated I could spit nails." Just as he finished speaking, Robert's words were emphasized by his fist slamming into the window frame, which caused Trevor to jump. "Sorry," Robert snapped, "but damn it, I hate watching my family fall apart right in front of my eyes, especially when there's nothing I can do to prevent it. I knew it would be a case of damned if I did, and damned if I didn't. No matter what. What could I say to Nancy that would help? What should I say to you with your current marriage plans and all? I feel like a heel as it is. On top of that, I've been loaded with problems at work. Now this mess at home. I've been really tense lately." Trevor nodded his understanding, even though he felt like an intruder trespassing on Robert's turmoil. "But I know how Robert feels in spades," Trevor thought. "I'm not even married yet, and my future family is already in a major crisis. Worse yet, the evidence that could destroy my future mother-in-law is lying right here in front of me. In spite of that, Robert seems more concerned over my feelings than his own. He's probably known about this from day one. When I first saw them together, Robert, I couldn't believe my eyes. After my insides had finished twisting into knots, I almost wished I hadn't found out. I've been trying to figure out a way to tell you. Since I know how much you love her and how close you are, I realized you wouldn't believe me without proof. Reluctantly, I felt I had to hire a PI and have them follow her. He was able to secure audio and video, but I purposely haven't looked at the visual evidence. I've only read parts of the transcript. They are damaging enough." Robert returned to his chair and slowly eased into it, still lost in thought. He absent-mindedly reached over and lightly ran a finger around the base of his ornate desk lamp. Suddenly, his eyes flickered between the label on the envelope and Trevor's face, momentarily pausing to study each. Trevor, there's probably more dirt in that package than any one person could ever want to see in a lifetime," Robert added with a sigh. After taking a moment to collect his thoughts, he continued, "She didn't realize I overheard her on the phone one afternoon in the den. Upon hearing that conversation, there was no doubt in my mind what was going on. For the next few days, I was forced to do some serious soul-searching. The rest," Robert said, animatedly pointing to the envelope in front of Trevor, "is history. Long ago, I was told by a friend whose wife had an affair. If there's any chance for reconciliation, don't look at the visual evidence. I didn't understand it then, but I think I do now," Robert continued. "I don't want to look because no matter what, I could never face Kathy again. Plus, I love my daughter and have too much respect for you." Trevor nodded as Robert finished, but looking confused, stated, "Don't worry about me, Robert. How you deal with Kathy is your business. You do what you have to." A little befuddled, Robert replied, "I have been terribly concerned about Kathy's reaction when she finds out what I know, but I've been waiting to spring it on her until I found out what you plan to do about Nancy." Bewildered, Trevor said, "It's more a question of how Nancy wants to proceed than what I want. I love her, and I'll do whatever she thinks is best." Robert replied, "I am surprised at your attitude, although I can't disagree. After all, she is my daughter, my baby, my little girl, and always will be, in spite of what she's done." "Sorry, Robert, but I have no idea what Nancy may have done to upset you," Trevor said. As he picked up his package, he shook it for emphasis. "I only know what Kathy and Kenneth O'Neill have been doing." Both men sat staring at each other briefly, their faces masks of confusion. Robert went pale with understanding. First, he backed away from Trevor's envelope like it was poisonous. His voice became a strangled gasp, stammering, "No, not Kathy. I'm talking about Nancy and her lover, the country western singer Bart Greenwald. What are you talking about? What are you saying? What is this about Kenneth O'Neill and my wife?" Trevor was confused. "What are you talking about, Robert? It's not Nancy that's having an affair. It's Kathy." The look of sorrow and pain on Robert's face forced Trevor to grasp the unthinkable. As Trevor's hand lost its strength, the package dropped, landing with a plop on the edge of Robert's desk. With a sad face, Robert reached into a desk drawer and pulled out a package similar to Trevor's, complete with the identical name stamp. In a desolate voice, he said, "By the way, Trevor, like you, I've only read certain portions of the transcript. When she's my daughter, I couldn't bring myself to look at the rest. TMI, as I believe you kids call it. Pain more tangible than any Trevor had ever endured coursed through him. Nancy, my Nancy is screwing around. But we are supposed to be getting married," Trevor said as he stood and stumbled backward, shaking his head in denial. As tears began to fall, Trevor almost tripped twice, staggering blindly toward the direction of the downstairs bathroom. Although he made it in time, his stomach didn't feel any better afterward. In spite of still being lightheaded, when the room finally quit spinning, Trevor stood. After splashing some cold water on his face and rinsing out his mouth, he reluctantly made his way back to Robert's office. Trevor found Robert just as he had left him, still sitting in his chair. Robert's eyes had a strange, wounded look, and his appearance seemed to have aged years in just the last few minutes. "How long has this been going on?" Trevor asked while sitting back down. When he looked up, he could see that Robert was lost in the shock of his own thoughts and pain. "Damn it, Robert, how long has she been cheating behind my back?" Trevor demanded to know. "I overheard the phone conversation 3 months ago," Robert said. Overriding feelings of desolation, looking up at Trevor, Robert demanded, "How long has Kathy been cheating on my butt?" Trevor shrugged. "I first saw them together about 3 weeks ago, but they appear to be very familiar with one another. So your guess is as good as mine." Robert pushed the package across the desk to Trevor and said, "I don't care what you do with it, but it's yours now. I'm just sorry that this has happened to both of us." Picking up the envelope, it felt 1,000 times heavier to Trevor than the one he had carried in earlier and had just slid across the desk to Robert. "Robert," Trevor said, "I felt there were a few things in the transcript you really needed to see. I made sure they were highlighted." Since Robert didn't respond, Trevor wasn't sure whether he had heard him. A few moments later, Trevor stood, ready to leave, when he heard Robert say, "Sorry, Trevor, but you have some nasty surprises in your package too." "Goodbye, Robert," Trevor answered. "Goodbye, Trevor. If you don't mind, I'll let you see yourself to the door," Robert almost whispered. As he drove away from the Albert Manor, Trevor said to himself, "I was right. I'm completely and royally screwed. Why, Nancy? In God's name, why?" Then, in a flash of anger, he suddenly realized, I bet Nancy's with her lover right now. Tightly gripping the steering wheel and staring straight ahead, Trevor's mind was racing even faster than his car as it sped through town, headed home. In a burst of reality, Trevor was startled out of his zombie-like state by the sound of a blaring car horn. Without thinking, Trevor had run a red light, barely missing another driver. Quickly pulling to the side of the road, his heart was pounding as he cursed himself under his breath. "You stupid idiot. Get your head out of your butt, or you'll end up getting killed." Trevor took a moment to regain his bearings and began to slowly calm down. Still a few miles from home, he remembered a parking lot just down the road that backed up to a dance club Nancy had brought him to on occasion. A few minutes later, Trevor parked his car in an isolated corner of that same parking lot. As he tried to unwind despite the pain, Trevor found himself unable to resist and began glancing through the transcript. Even though a bottle of water helped quench his thirst, it couldn't wash away the bile taste left by the reading material. Tears rolled down his face as the reality expressed on the pages began to sink in. The 4 times Nancy and her lover had been caught together were described so vividly, it caused his grief to spread like cancer. Trevor could almost hear Nancy's lust-filled comments as her voice rang in his ears while he read, "Yes, Bart, screw your lover." Every word she had used to encourage her lover, Trevor had personally heard hundreds of times before. Each one now pierced his heart like an arrow. Being in misery, Trevor lost track of time and looked up in shock to find the parking lot had filled up. A group of people had gathered at the front door of the club, waiting to get in. The music from the club brought to mind the last time he and Nancy had been here. Trevor could still see her saying, "This is so erotic." In the back of his mind, Trevor knew that getting home was essential. He needed to relax and take the time to think things through. So after freeing himself from the nostalgic interlude, he began rapidly flipping through the remaining pages. Suddenly, like a moth to a flame, his eyes were irresistibly drawn to a highlighted section of conversation. "Damn it, Nancy. After this weekend, I'm going to feel very slighted. In spite of how much I want you, the only other time I get before your wedding is when you go to the spa. Believe me, Bart, that isn't going to be our last time. After my honeymoon, you and I are going to find ways to get together a lot more. You're too damn hot. And after this weekend, baby, there's no possible way I'm going to give you up. So don't worry, for a long time to come, you'll be getting more of me than you can handle. Trust me, I've got everything under control. I do trust you, and I can't give you up either, Nancy. You're not only the sexiest, but also the most adventurous little hottie I've ever met." Giggling and laughter. "Oh, Bart. Screw me, baby." The words began to blur as Trevor's eyes filled with tears just before they trickled down his face. With his heart pounding in his ears, Trevor's breath became tortured gasps as he stared unseeing at the cars parked around him. The transcript slipped from his grasp. His world shifted as Trevor's life with Nancy crumbled under the weight of his pain and loss. The picture-perfect life he had lived up to this moment was crumbling all around him like a sandcastle being systematically ravaged by decimating waves. "Why, Nancy? Why?" Trevor repeatedly asked while rocking back and forth, slamming into the headrest. Trevor didn't know how long he had been staring into space when he noticed a movement near the club. Looking up, his eyes narrowed, and the churning pain in his gut suddenly turned into searing anger. Two of Nancy's very close friends, Tanya and Emily, were walking unsteadily from the club toward the parking lot. It just so happened that they were the very same two who were supposed to be with Nancy at that very moment. Not realizing Tanya had parked just a couple of rows over, Trevor watched in surprise as they approached. For a few brief seconds, he was unsure what to do, wondering, is Nancy with them? Still in the club after a night of dancing. The girls were arm in arm, without a care in the world. Reaching Tanya's car, the two young women relaxed by leaning on the hood, joking and laughing. When Emily motioned toward the club, neither of them noticed Trevor get out of his car. He could hear footsteps on the gravel as he stormed toward them. Both turned to face Trevor just before he reached them, caught by surprise. Their eyes went wide with shock, and Emily, in an alcohol-slurred voice, said, "Trevor, you were supposed to be with Mr. R." Tanya suddenly snapped, "Can it, Emily?" which caused Emily to quickly cower. "What can we do for you, Trevor?" Tanya asked, her tone barely polite. Trevor stopped a few feet from Tanya, with whom he had never been very close. Their relationship over the years could best be described as mutual toleration, but under the current circumstances, he could care less who she was or what she thought. Staring at the two girls, Trevor's smoldering eyes finally locked on Tanya. "You seem to be missing somebody," Trevor spat. "Nightlife at the spa must have been pretty dull to spend 4 hours driving back here just to dance." Emily's eyes grew wide as she blurted out, "Oh gosh, Tanya, I'm going to be sick." Shaking in open disgust, Trevor fought to keep himself under control as his hands clenched into fists. He snarled, "Now why ever would you think I know anything, Emily? Oh, you must be referring to my precious Nancy and Bart Greenwald." "Get in the car," Tanya ordered, before turning to face Trevor. Looking him straight in the eye, she said, "I told Nancy flat out that I would not, I repeat, not, lie for her. As you can see, she isn't here with us, so draw your own conclusions, but don't ask me any more questions. Then I won't have to lie." Emily stumbled into the car as Trevor backed up, so Tanya could do the same. Still seething, Trevor turned to leave when Tanya unexpectedly rolled down her window and said, "Trevor, I'm sorry, and Emily is too. But Nancy didn't go looking for this, it just happened. She never started out to do this on purpose, but it just got out of control. I know it doesn't make sense, but she really does love you." He waited for a few moments, then his shoulders dropped as he looked back. They knew his original rage had subsided when, in a very tired voice, he replied, "I appreciate your candor, but it doesn't change a damn thing." Just as Tanya revved her engine, Trevor caught a brief glimpse of Emily dialing her cell phone before they peeled out, headed for the exit. He could guess who she was calling. Suddenly feeling decades older than his 27 years, Trevor walked slowly back to his car. After getting in and starting it up, he pulled out into traffic and headed home. As he pulled up to his house, Tanya's parting words came drifting back. "Nancy didn't go looking for this. It just happened, but got out of control." Was that supposed to make me feel better? He wondered aloud. Whether it happened on purpose or not, she let this Bart guy have her, and repeatedly went back for more. Suddenly remembering the transcript, he angrily railed. On top of that, Nancy then tells him they'll get together after she's married, after the honeymoon. After turning off the ignition, Trevor stormed into the house. The first thing he did was double-lock all the entrances and flip off the garage door opener. "No way is Nancy getting her little butt into this house again without going through me first," he viciously proclaimed. After checking his phones, Trevor didn't know why, but he felt relieved that there were no messages on either one. Yet. Well, one thing's for sure now. Nancy can not only do whatever she wants, but also whenever, because as of this moment, she no longer has a fiancé. At least not one named Trevor, he tearfully snarled. Crawling into bed, Trevor lay there languishing in his own anguish. Why, Nancy? For God's sake, why? He curled into a ball, just wanting the mind-numbing pain to stop. The feeling of aching emptiness was throwing his raw emotions into a cauldron of sheer agonizing turmoil as they vacillated wildly between rage, pain, fear, and hopelessness. Trevor checked his cell phone one more time. Seeing there were still no messages, he snapped it shut in frustration. Certain she was with her lover, Trevor angrily spat. Well, it's difficult to talk with something in your mouth. Nancy came speeding down the street, panicked all the way home. Unintentionally, Nancy accidentally braked, sending her car into a sideways skid before coming to a stop in front of Trevor's house. Her normally flawless makeup was a disaster from crying, matching her red, swollen eyes. It was one of the rare times that looks didn't matter to Nancy. Her only concern was getting to Trevor. She tried to push her key into the lock several times without success. In growing frustration, Nancy sobbed, "Dear God, please let him be here," then pleaded, "Trevor, please," as her open palm pounded in panic against the dead door. Turning to push the doorbell, she noticed her name in big red letters on an envelope tacked to the wood framing. In spite of her sudden desire to be anywhere else, her trembling hand slowly reached out and, with steady pressure, gingerly pulled it loose. Nancy paused for a moment to fight off her growing spasms of nausea and fear. Finally, she opened it and began to read. "Nancy, don't try your key. The locks have been changed. Forget the doorbell. I've already left. I will be at your parents' house later this afternoon if you want to talk. Trevor." After reading it several times, she stared at the door of what had previously been her future home. Sadly, she firmly suspected that it would probably never be part of her life again. Noticing that the curtains were open, Nancy looked into a couple of the windows to make sure Trevor wasn't home. The warmth from the good memories as she looked inside caused her to fall to her knees, sobbing. As Nancy unsteadily made her way back to her car, she kept looking over her shoulder at the door, praying and pleading for Trevor to open it and make everything all right. Her body was racked with convulsive sobs. Nancy collapsed over the steering wheel, wondering in grief, "What have I done? I've lost my heart and soul." In shock, she sat for a long time, just staring at Trevor's house. Finally starting her car and slowly driving away, Nancy felt the weight of her world crumbling around her. At the very moment Nancy was reading Trevor's note, he was sitting in a restaurant across town. His face was drawn and etched with sorrow, unable to taste a thing. Trevor was forcing himself to eat as he mechanically picked at his food. His emotional whirlwind of the last few days had left him completely drained, and he sat, lost in thought, staring out the window. Even though it was a late spring day filled with bright sunshine, it felt bleak and cold to him. Although Nancy's affair had fractured their relationship, its final desecration was her desire to be with her lover after the honeymoon. Knowing in his heart what had to be done didn't make Trevor's pain any less intense. For the first time in his life, he knew what people meant when they said, "I just want to die and get it over with." The experiences of life told him that time would work miracles, albeit slowly. All Trevor could do now was wait patiently in the wake of time's relentless march, praying that when his new life arrived, the old one, along with its pain, would be completely gone. Glancing up at the clock, he listlessly grumbled, 1:15. Damn. Only 5 minutes later than the last time I looked. Trevor received his first surprise after arriving at Albert Manor, when the door opened before he could even ring the bell. "Tanya," Trevor said as he addressed his second surprise. The young woman standing in front of him nodded slightly, bowing her head. Tanya's eyes refused to meet his as she informed him. With her folks in an uproar, along with everything else, Nancy needs all the support she can get. "That's the reason I'm here. Nancy's in the garden. She's been waiting for you. Nobody will bother the two of you there." While heading for the back door, Trevor heard his future ex-father-in-law's angry voice blaring through the hallways. Robert has too much energy, Trevor thought, realizing, I'm too damn tired to get that worked up. Trevor found Nancy standing on a grassy knoll overlooking the lake behind the manor. Even from a distance, he could tell she was crying, and for a brief moment, he felt a tremendous urge to try and comfort her. But then, remembering that Nancy's actions had all been of her own choosing, Trevor paused and thought, having to pay the piper really sucks. Taking a hard look, he couldn't help noticing that her hair and dress were a disaster. For some reason, the fact that she was hurting didn't make Trevor feel the least bit better, even though the thought crossed his mind that it should have. When just a few feet away, he stopped and said, Nancy, I'm here, but I don't know for how long. So if you've got something to say, make it quick. She visibly stiffened at the tone of his voice, but between her fear and shame, she couldn't turn around. Trevor, I'm so sorry. Her voice suddenly faltered, and her shoulders slumped as Nancy's sobbing face fell forward into her open palms. Seeing her like this was putting him through an emotional wringer. Even though Trevor still loved her deeply, Nancy's betrayal had destroyed the pillars of that love. In a strained voice, heavy with irritation, he asked, Will you please face me? She shook her head and replied, I can't. I'm pretty sure what I did was beyond anything either of us would have ever dreamed I was capable of doing. Just knowing that my stupid, foolish actions have destroyed what we had together makes it too difficult for me. Nancy sobbed. It may be more of my selfish behavior, but I love you too much. I would do anything if I could make this up to you. But through our love, I've come to know you too well. From the pain in your voice, I can tell your heart, as big as it is, has been crushed. Slowly, she quit crying and said, Trevor, I didn't start out to cheat on you, and I won't offer any stupid excuses now. It all started with the simple fact that Tanya, Emily, and I had a habit of visiting different dance clubs over the past year. About 6 months ago, Emily met a band member who was performing at a country and western nightclub where she enjoyed the music. His band wasn't a headliner, but they were local stars in their own right. When I first met Bart, their lead singer and bass guitarist, I made sure to explain I was very engaged, and in the beginning, I acted accordingly. Over the ensuing months, we kept returning to the same club because Emily wanted to see her guy and listen to their music. That turned out to be the biggest mistake of my life. I became good friends with Bart. Too good, it turns out, as our teasing and flirting slowly turned sexual in nature. One night, about 3 months ago, we stayed and helped the band pack up after the club closed. I suddenly found myself all alone with Bart when Emily took off with her guy, and Tanya went with the other 2 members. The next thing I knew, Bart and I were kissing. That's all that happened that night. But on the way home, I found myself confused, ashamed, and at the same time, embarrassingly excited. Both girls kept telling me I needed to cool off and get away from Bart. I knew they were right. But for the moment, the thrill of the forbidden was enough to keep me playing with fire. I was so sure I could control it. How could I have been so stupid? Anyway, about 2 months ago, I crossed that line of no return by finally allowing myself to become sexually involved with Bart. We've met 5 times, including the weekend I was away, but never at any of our places, the places you and I go. Before you ask, this wasn't about him being better than you or more capable of satisfying me, which he wasn't, by the way. It was more like a high school crush, and I made the mistake of allowing the infatuation to turn into lust, which evidently became too irresistible. Please don't ask me for the details. I'll tell you if you really want to know, but it just makes me sick to think about it now. Trevor, I just want you to know that I'll regret every minute of this for the rest of my life. It has not only cost me, but also hurt what I love most. You. He had been taken aback by the strange sound of finality in her voice. Deep and mournful like the forlorn cry of a distant seagull, her voice had sounded almost mechanical, as if she were reading off a teleprompter. But from what Trevor was able to recall of the PI's report, Nancy's confession rang true. Suddenly, it dawned on him. Her methodical delivery was not to downplay the situation, but to get through it without a meltdown. Trevor realized that everything she had just said was tearing her up emotionally. He watched Nancy shiver as she wrapped her arms around her body in what appeared to be a physical attempt to hold herself together. With that thought, Trevor felt a rush of sympathetic tenderness, which he immediately suppressed. He replied, "Nancy, I think you already know the wedding and the engagement are off, at least for the time being. We need some time apart. And please, no contact of any sort until I get my head around this. It may take a while. And it will only get worse if you try to pressure me into making a quick decision. Right now, you would lose." As Trevor finished speaking, Nancy began to sob in earnest, and her body convulsed with spasms. He waited for her to regain her composure before asking one last question. "Nancy, why?" After fighting a losing battle to keep her tears at bay, she replied in a breaking voice, "Trevor, that's the one thing I haven't been able to figure out. All I can say is that I went out with friends and let everything get out of control. I've been so guilt-ridden that I couldn't live with it anymore. Tanya and Emily thought I had gone to the spa this weekend just to be with Bart, but I only went there Friday night to break it off with him. Before he even got out of his car, I told him to go away and leave me alone. He threw a fit and made a big scene, calling me all kinds of names, telling me I was a tease and cussing me for wasting his time. I spent the entire weekend alone, thinking about you, us, and our future. If you want to confirm what I said, all you have to do is call the spa. They had to get the police there before he would leave. On my way home this morning, I turned my cell on and saw there were several messages from Tanya and Emily. I knew my world had ended, and I almost wrecked when I heard Tanya say, 'Oh, Nancy, Trevor knows it all. He knows everything. Believe it or not. Trevor, I love you dearly and always will, but by betraying your trust, I made a mockery of that love. Now I get to live with the gut-wrenching pain while reaping the bitterness of what I've done. You will never know how much, but believe me, I am so sorry for what I have done. Yes, it was an exciting rush, but now I know it wasn't worth losing you, the man I truly love.'" Trevor had not been able to shake her words from the transcript out of his memory. He now couldn't resist smirking as he sarcastically mocked, "Yeah, I'm glad you're so sorry. Evidently, you're sorry enough that you'll find a way to get back with good old Bart after the honeymoon. And not just once, but more than he can handle." Reacting to a wave of grief-stricken shame, Nancy shrieked in a high-pitched voice, "Oh God, no, I'm so sorry. Yes, I told him that, but it was only in the heat of passion. I knew how wrong it was the instant it left my mouth, because I didn't mean a word of it. I knew I wanted." Trevor immediately interrupted, "Enough, Nancy," not caring to hear any more. As he stepped forward, he continued, "There is absolutely no need to make this more difficult than it already is. Just give me back my ring and I'll be on my way," Trevor firmly said, his voice devoid of emotion and total despair. Nancy finally realized it was over. She had truly lost him. With her head still turned, she held out her arm and, with trembling fingers, handed him her engagement ring. After taking it, Trevor said, "Nancy, you have a few more of my things that I would like back." In a small, scared voice, she quietly replied, "I'll have Tanya bring over everything I have. If you don't mind, I need to get my things from your house. If you want, you can sort through them first." He replied softly, "That's fine, Nancy. Just leave a message on my cell, and I'll have someone at the house when you're ready." She nodded quietly, weeping. In the ensuing silence, the short distance between them turned into an impassable gulf. He finally broke the spell with, "Goodbye, Nancy." As Trevor turned and began to walk toward the house, he heard a strangled sob followed by, "Goodbye, Trevor." Tanya looked up as he opened the door. Trevor could see the last bit of hope fade from her teary eyes. After crossing the room to kiss him on the cheek, she whispered, "I'm so sorry." After a sympathetic shrug, Trevor headed for the front door. From behind him, he heard Tanya say, "Oh, Nancy." Her strained voice was almost hoarse as he heard Nancy cry out in pain, "My God, Tanya, I've lost him. I've lost my love. I've lost Trevor." As he opened the front door, Trevor heard Robert Albert's aggravated voice clearly say, "Kathy, just give it a rest. At least for a few days. Then I will look for a good marriage counselor or something." After closing the door behind him, Trevor started down the steps, shaking his head, thinking, "I don't know how, but that sounds like a possible reconciliation to me." He sighed. "I guess it's understandable, considering they have more than 20 years together. If Nancy and I had that kind of investment, maybe things would be different. But now, well, who gives a rat?" Trevor gazed at the Albert Manor for what he felt would probably be the last time, and said to himself, "I was right that first day. I am completely and royally screwed." Weeks later, Trevor felt in a quandary when he experienced yet another of those memorable moments where his strong feelings for Nancy painfully resurfaced. What immediately came to mind was an old Bee Gees song, "How Can You Mend a Broken Heart?" Everywhere he turned, there was something that reminded him of her. To her credit, Nancy had not attempted to make contact, thereby giving Trevor the space he had requested. But no matter how hard Trevor tried, he just couldn't get past the casualness of her betrayal. After weeks of struggling, Trevor came to a painful conclusion. In order to move on with his life, he would have to relocate. It would have to be a place that held no memories of Nancy. Thankfully, the structure of his business was such that it would allow Trevor all the flexibility needed without impacting his clientele. A few days after making that decision, he finished packing for his move to the coast. Trevor, wanting to tell Nancy goodbye, tried to call her that night before he left, but she didn't answer. As his only remaining recourse, Trevor sent an email to inform Nancy that, for the foreseeable future, he wouldn't be back. She never returned his call or email. Trevor's decision to relocate proved to be a good one, and he slowly began to recover and move on. Over the next few months, Trevor started dating a nice young lady named Karen Rossi. He was quickly captivated by her smile, wit, intellect, and finely toned body. When they both decided to take the relationship up a notch, Trevor sat down with her and explained the baggage he still carried. After hearing his story, Karen understood his feelings but knew that, in order to win his love, she would have to slowly and gently help him expand all his boundaries. It turned out to be just the thing Trevor needed to learn how to trust and love again. Having just celebrated the second anniversary of their first date, Trevor and Karen were now in an extremely happy and loving relationship. The depth of their love and commitment was obvious to everyone around them. Karen had met Trevor's parents, but he had never been able to get together with her mother, even though he had spoken to her several times on the phone. Her father had passed away when she was a little girl. While that Karen's mom, Tan Rossi, was flying in to see her daughter, Trevor was finally about to meet her. While holding tight to Trevor's arm, Karen searched the sea of faces pouring through the security gates. All at once, she started jumping with excitement, waving her arms and yelling, "Mom, over here." Trevor watched as a dark-haired woman with sunglasses sitting on top of her head suddenly waved back. She made her way to them, and even though she was wearing a light floral dress, she lifted Karen up in a big hug. Tan took the time to admire her daughter at arm's length before finally saying, "Baby, you look good. I'm glad to see you've been taking care of yourself." Karen quickly chimed in, "Mom, this is Trevor, the man I love." After tentatively extending his hand, Trevor was caught by surprise when Tan stepped forward and grabbed him in a bear hug. He squeaked out, "Nice to meet you, Mom." With her eyes narrowing into slits, the small, wiry woman stepped back and stared at Trevor intently. It made him feel very uncomfortable until she said, "Trevor, all I ask is that you treat my daughter well, and both of you do everything you can to ensure each other's happiness." He pulled Karen tight and replied, I will do that, ma'am. I promise you. The intense look on Tan's face gave way to a huge smile as she responded. I've been informed that, in spite of your youth, you are an honorable young man with strong convictions and the courage to act on them. I was also told that once I met you, all my concerns for my daughter would be put to rest. Her daughter asked, Mom, why do you mean that? I've told you a lot of great things about Trevor, but I don't recall ever saying anything like that. You didn't, Karen, came a strong male voice from behind Tan. The stranger walked up behind her and continued, and I think I can speak from experience. Tan turned slightly to look up at the man and said to her daughter, Honey, I know this is a total surprise, but as of last night, I want you to meet my fiancé, Robert Albert. Trevor didn't utter a sound other than a slight gasp as he stood with his mouth open, just staring in shock. Stunned, Karen watched as Trevor and Robert locked in a strong embrace. Karen smiled and said, As you can see, daughter, the man you love already knows Robert. It turns out that they share a long and interesting history. Destiny, it would appear, intends to have them continue it. As they looked at their smiling men, Karen's mother hugged her and said, It seems we're the lucky ones. We get to share it with them. Trevor nodded and replied, I agree, ladies, but for now, let's get the luggage and find a quiet spot to eat lunch. Then Robert and I can catch you ladies up on the rest of the story. Thanks to everyone who took the time to listen to today's stories. If you enjoyed it, please consider liking and subscribing if you haven't already. Feel free to share your thoughts on the events in the comments below. Take care,